I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Todd DeShida.
And I'm Thomas Mills.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a couple concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference. And to start things off, Happy New Year to everyone. We made it through 2022. How are you guys feeling about 2023?
Terrible.
Well, I can tell you from where I sit, it's already 2023, and it's not as bad as 2022 was. So things are looking up from this direction. It's all good.
Yeah, no. Hopefully, it'll be a good year.
Well, we do our occasional discussion about how we've contributed, to helping fight climate change. Maybe we need to talk about goals for 2023. I'm putting you on the spot here. I expect eloquent, well thought out answers.
I still need to do more to, I think, improve my diet, and I think that would be a good one. I need to be more of a flexitarian, or definitely cut out beef as much as possible. I think would be a good goal for me.
That's solid. So eat a few more Impossible and Beyond Meat burgers.
Yeah, and I've been doing that, but I need to just monitor it more, and I need to venture out of my area and find some more biodiesel if I'm going to be driving my car more than I have been in the past.
Well, listeners should know though that you also do have an electric, right? It's just
I do. Just my other car.
Right,
Yeah.
your backup.
Yeah.
What about you, Thomas? Any climate aspirations for 2023?
Well, I finally got one of these DC fast chargers installed two or 3 weeks ago. I've got 2 more to do at the start of this year, and it'd be great to get those wrapped up because they were supposed to be in last year. But yeah, I guess at a personal level, I think I've got to make sure that when I go and plant trees, they survive. I've planted a lot of trees in the last few years, but it's remembering to go and water them because it's that first 3 or 4 years that you've got to get them through till they can sort of get those roots deep enough and keep running with it. But I don't know. I can't get can't cut many more carbon miles out of my food, and I don't eat any beef anymore. I've got 3 rabbits in the fridge at the moment that I've been eating, so
Nice.
I'll maybe stick to a bit of that. But yeah, it's when I do these things where I go and plant these trees, I've got to make sure that we keep the water on them and that they go on to sequester carbon for the next 100+ years.
You do live a pretty green lifestyle, Thomas, and it's good to know that you're personally taking on, setting up the DC fast charging network for Tasmania.
Yeah, thanks.
What about you, Lewis? What are you thinking about doing?
Well, on a personal level, our house, and I think we've talked about this on other episodes, is pretty inefficient as homes go. It's an older home, and so want to look into basically going through and insulating all the walls. There's some insulation in the attic, but insulating all the walls, ideally putting in new windows, and so making it a lot cheaper to both heat and to cool, and in turn reducing emissions there.
Especially with some of the summers we have around here these days.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, pivoting to today's topic, while climate change is finally starting to get the media attention that I feel like it truly deserves, the loss in biodiversity that has been running in parallel really just gets a fraction of the headlines it should. And the two crises actually have a lot more in common than you might think, from kind of what's driving them on the one end to their solutions on the other. And so this week, we're going to explore those linkages with an exciting guest we have from the World Wildlife Fund. But before we go there and dive into the good stuff, let's talk about this week's reason for hope.
Yeah. So there's this really cool story about this Maryland couple. Their name's Janet and Jeff Crouch from Maryland. And they had, one of these pollinator gardens for a lawn and had, a bunch of native species. And their neighbor got all bent out of shape. And they happened to live in a community with a homeowners association, right? And so this guy ended up, complaining enough that the homeowners association was like, hey, you got to take this stuff out and you got to put in good old fashioned grass. And they were like, no, we don't want to do that. And so they kind of battled back and forth to the point where they were going to get forced to do this. And so they sued, this homeowners association. and got a lawyer. Finally ended up going to court on this, and one of their legislators picked this up and was like, "Hey, we want to use this case and put a law in the state that says these homeowner associations can't do this to you, and you can keep your lawn." And so there's now a law in Maryland that basically limits what these associations can do to tell you that you got to have grass in your lawn, because as you know, grass is just, it's terrible, and lawns make up about 1/3 of the U.S.'s 135 million acres of residential landscaping, right? And there's a lot of people that are part of these homeowner associations too. Like 74 million people belong to one of these things. So, hopefully if other states do this, it could be kind of a big deal. And more people are starting to go to these like pollinator lawns. The National Wildlife Federation said in 2020 there was about a 50% increase of people, basically creating these wildlife gardens, so that are certified by that organization. So pretty cool. And yeah, this article is New York Times, and I really like the title. It's "They Fought the Lawn and the Lawn's Done." I like that. It makes me think, that song, because I'm always thinking of songs anyway. I'm sure my neighbors are pissed, man. I don't live in an HOA because they'd have kicked me out a long time ago. I was thinking like my song would be like, "This is a story about a man named Todd pisses neighbors off for not keeping up his lawn." That's me, man. But I need to get some more native plants in there, because I just basically have a lawn that I don't take care of, which is a little different than like actually planting stuff, strategically. But I need to get a bunch of native plants and like take out a bunch of grass and put in more, just landscaping rock.
To your point, there's big opportunity there, right? I mean, all those green spaces around us have the potential to be good habitat, right? For pollinators, birds.
No, I mean, when it comes to lawn, it's just something that's in between my fruit trees. Like, I don't
Yeah,
know. I don't have a lot of
sure.
use for it otherwise. I'm really not that much into eating grass. I don't know about you guys. I'd rather feed it to rabbits
He's
than eat
into
them.
smoking it. Just kidding.
Well, as we kind of tee up today's topic, I think it might be good for those who don't necessarily have a ton of context on the biodiversity loss that we're experiencing, and we'll get into this to some degree. But I thought I would share a few numbers at the outset. So, on average, and this is actually a World Wildlife Fund study, global populations of wildlife are documented as declining about 69%, so roughly 70% between 1970 and 2016. So, let that sink in for a minute, that basically in a 35-year period, we've lost nearly 70% of our global wildlife populations.
It's crazy.
It is. And, another way to look at it is sort of the opposite side, which is that farmed animals, so things like mainly cows and pigs, now constitute 60% of the global biomass of all mammals. Humans make up 36%, which means that wild mammals makes up just 4% of the world's mammal biomass.
That's nuts.
So with that, you can see how critical it is that, we're paying attention to this crisis and actively taking steps to stem the losses. And so to help us navigate the topic of biodiversity, because it is a complex one, we're lucky enough today to have Dr. Rebecca Shaw from the World Wildlife Fund on the show. Rebecca is the chief scientist at the World Wildlife Fund. She works with experts around the world to identify the emerging challenges to WWF's mission and advance scientific inquiry into the development of strategic solutions to those challenges. She leads the WWF's global science team. She has been published widely in leading peer-reviewed scientific journals, as well as a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change's fifth assessment report. And Dr. Shaw holds a MA in Environmental Policy and a PhD in Energy and Resources from the University of California at Berkeley. And we're excited to have her here on the program today. Rebecca, welcome to Climate Optimists.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so grateful to be talking to you today.
Let's start you off with a question we do all our guests. When you think about efforts to address climate change, what makes you hopeful?
There's a lot of things that provide me with a lot of hope. One of the things I always tell people when I'm asked a question like this is I was in a lot of despair, say 20 years ago, when the impacts of climate change weren't yet as evident, but I knew what was coming because I was studying the issue. And being at that place where you know and you're trying to warn people, you're kind of like Chicken Little running around conference to conference telling people, you don't understand what's about to happen. Well, so now the science has gotten so much better. We know more. We're experience the impacts in real time, and those impacts are actually scientifically attributable to the greenhouse gas emissions and the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. That you have many, many more people, not just me and a few colleagues focused on this in remote meetings, many, many more people in many disciplines focused on this issue. And so when you can't just go to one climate meeting anymore. There are hundreds and thousands of them every single year. And with the banking sector and the private sector that focuses on food and focuses on energy and governments around the world, everybody's talking about this. And I think most importantly, the youth movement is very, very active and very engaged. Um, I'm not alone in talking about this. I'm not Chicken Little anymore. I'm not. I'm one of a million voices, which makes me very happy. I have company, and there's momentum. And whenever you have that kind of social focus, big change can happen, and it can happen rapidly. So that's what gives me a lot of hope and a lot of optimism for the future.
I like the message. I guess before we get into our discussion about biodiversity and how it links with climate change, um, wondering if you could talk a little bit about just how you got into your role as chief scientist at the World Wildlife Fund, and then give us maybe a basic kind of definition of what biodiversity is for folks who might not be familiar.
Yeah, I studied both climate change and biodiversity for my master's in policy and my science PhD. And I was really interested in the impacts of climate on biodiversity and how those downstream impacts on humans around the globe because of it. I started in academics, but then quickly realized that the forces that were at play that were degrading the climate and nature globally needed more than just science. It needed science focus on action, and that's when I really started my applied science, and then I moved from academics into the nonprofit sector to really focus on that direct link between science and application to advance solutions much more rapidly. So biodiversity is it's an interesting concept, and it really has evolved over time. When you use the word biodiversity, it's kind of it's kind of a technical term, and it's kind of wonky. And often people think that it means the number of species on the planet, but it actually there's a much richer definition of biodiversity or biological diversity. Biodiversity has many dimensions. It encompasses the diversity of genes, different types of species, how those species come together to develop populations, different populations of the same species across space. It includes habitat diversity, ecosystem diversity, and then the diversity of the flow of benefits from ecosystems to humans. So it's a kind of a tiered there's different levels of biological organization that all are captured in the term biodiversity. So when we're talking about biodiversity, we're really talking about everything having to do with nature and nature's activities and the connections that create the fabric of life that support life on this planet. It's a broad definition.
So it's big and expansive,
Big and expansive, yeah.
and complex, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. But often people measure number of species, the number of bird species you see, the number of mammal species, because that's an easy measure or an easy metric to get a handle on how rich is this place, how many kinds of animals or many kinds of life forms do we find. But it really is much deeper than that.
Yeah, and my knowledge of biology is not super deep, but I do remember in some work I've done in the past that your point about populations was a new thing for me. Probably 10 years ago, we were talking about even you have a certain type of salmon, let's say, but you might have 10, 15 different populations, different genetic makeups within that species. So it's not just that particular type of salmon; it's all of the populations beneath it.
That's right. And salmon are a really great example of all levels of diversity because not only you might have one species of salmon across the entire west coast of the US, and that species will have different populations, and those populations will go up different rivers or go up different rivers at different times of the year. And so it's really interesting. And so they never really meet. These different populations or different species never really meet. But it's really interesting how this diversity plays out. Salmon's also a really great example because there's real obvious human benefit to those salmon runs. We harvest those different salmon runs at different times of the year to put salmon on our plates to give us protein. We don't often think about that as a benefit of nature, but it is a very tangible benefit of nature. We don't have to do a lot to capture that benefit. We just have to go out and fish. We don't have to put in inputs into the production. Nature does all that for us. We put out a hook, we get a beautiful salmon on our plate, and we get all those amazing omega fatty acids that are so important for our nutrition. So that's a real good example of the diversity of life, but also how that diversity benefits humans directly.
So let's talk a little bit about biodiversity loss to give folks some context. Kind of what sort of the rate of loss are we experiencing today, and how is it changing with time?
Yeah, there's lots of kinds of metrics that you can look at, and we do look at it since biodiversity as a concept and as a definition is broad. We look at a lot of different metrics. The one metric we really lean in hard to use at the World Wildlife Fund, where I am the chief scientist, is the Living Planet Index. And the Living Planet Index is a really important metric because it looks at populations of species across the planet and looks at their relative rates of change in abundance. So what we've seen, measuring 32,000 population of 5,000 different species across land, ocean, and freshwater systems, is that we've seen a 69% decline in the relative abundance of species over time from 1970 to 2018. That
Wow.
is within our lifetimes really significant loss of a measure of biodiversity, population, relative abundance. What that says to us is that nature is unraveling in a lot of places. Now, it doesn't mean that every species and every population is going down. It means, on average, across the globe, we've seen a percentage decline in populations of 69%. And it doesn't matter, what metric you're using. 69% is a huge decrease. And the reason why we worry about it is we are systematically destroying other life forces on the planet, but it's also because we're undermining the way nature works to provide us benefits. So we're undermining our own well-being, which is really concerning moving into the future, particularly in the context of climate change.
In other words, for those of us who are appreciate nature and the outdoors, we can look at this from sort of an altruistic perspective and say we need to take care of other life forms, but there's also a very real connection to our ability to exist and survive on the planet. And so, even if, let's say, we didn't have a vested interest in protecting other species, even from a selfish perspective, there's a very real threat to our our well-being.
That's right. And the reason why we look at populations, we want to look at populations around the globe that has a nice distribution around the globe across different systems, is that when you begin to see declines like that, you begin to see the unraveling of the way ecosystems are functioning. And every single every single species within an ecosystem plays a function. Some are outsized functions for the kind of benefits we care about. Some don't have as great a role to play in that regard. But what it says is that they're unraveling, and they're not going to be able to play the functions that they had been in the past, and it's to our detriment.
So I guess let's pivot from there to kind of what's driving this biodiversity loss. And I'm sure it, varies by geography, but kind of what are the primary drivers of the losses that we're seeing today? And then I guess as an extra layer, given our focus on climate change, is where does climate change fit into that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There was just a really nice global assessment done in 2019 that looked at by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services that looked around the globe at biodiversity loss and its drivers. And what we see is that for land based systems, the biggest driver of loss is habitat destruction. And that habitat destruction largely comes from deforestation and the modification of land to grow food and food crops around the globe, particularly in the tropics, where you really have really high rates of biodiversity and really high rates of biodiversity loss because of the expansion of agricultural lands. In marine systems or in the oceans, the biggest driver of loss is overharvesting, so overfishing. Overharvesting is also important in land systems, but not to the extent that it is in marine system. And what we see is that across all these systems, that climate change impacts are becoming a more and more significant driver of biodiversity loss than they had been in the past. For the last 10 years, 20 years, 20 years ago, climate change was really pushing species and ecosystems, habitats around and really changing them. What we're seeing now, though, with an increase in really extreme events, droughts, fires, floods, that you can have wholesale wipeout of populations with a single climate change event. And that's where we're seeing real declines in species. And a really good example of that was the fires that happened in Eastern Australia in 2019, 2020, where we lost 6 populations of koalas across a very vast range of forest, and those populations will take many, many years to rebound, if they can rebound at all.
So, so generally speaking, it sounds like on land, it's really our need, our increasing need for more and more food or certain types of
Mm-hmm.
food
Mm-hmm.
that's driving that habitat loss and in turn biodiversity loss. A similar sort of need for food when it comes to marine systems, and then climate change with these extreme events is becoming a threat as well. Not just that maybe a certain species is moving to a different habitat because of changes in, moisture and temperature, et cetera, but that you can have a single event that impacts an entire population of a given species.
That's right. That it's also, I mean, and again, can't underscore enough the increasing role that climate change is playing on undermining biodiversity and the health of nature. And again, we see these extreme events are really important. These sharp heat events or these extreme heat events are also really important in the land sector as well as in the ocean, and where we're seeing coral reef bleaching. Many people know that coral reefs are hotspots of biodiversity, species richness, and in many places around the globe, 50% of the corals have been bleached. So that's really a major loss from extreme heat.
And for those who may not be familiar with coral bleaching, bleaching in effect kills off that coral that was living. Is that correct?
That's right. Coral is just fascinating because it's the coming together of two kind of organisms to create these magical places where fish and other types of species live. But it's the coming together of the coral with the algae that produces the food, and the coral houses the food, houses that algae, and that algae produces food, and that's where you get all this great production. What the bleaching does is it kills the algae that resides within the coral body, therefore starving the coral. So the extreme heat kills the algae, and that causes mass die-off of the algae, which then kills the coral as well. And so extreme heat events that we're seeing in in tropical waters in particular is really concerning for the die-off of corals.
So, not to go down continue to go down sort of this negative path, but I'm wondering, is there an anticipated sort of tipping point when it comes to biodiversity loss, like there is with climate change? I mean, obviously we're experiencing climate change, and that's set to get worse. How worse it gets and how catastrophic depends on our response. And I'm wondering, is there something analogous when it comes to biodiversity loss?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It goes back to the way we measure biodiversity and the way we understand biodiversity on the planet. And it's not as simple as it is climate. Climate's really um, it's we've got one metric we can measure to understand the impact of climate, and that's CO2 equivalent. So that even though there's different types of greenhouse gases from a wide array of human activities that flow into the atmosphere, creating the greenhouse gas effect, it's not so easy with biodiversity because, as I said before, biodiversity is defined by different levels about biological organization, genes, organisms, species, habitats, ecosystem benefits to people. So there's no one measurable unit that helps you combine them all and then walk through the scientific process to see that outcome. What we are seeing, though, that I think is really important, is we're seeing collapses in biodiversity or losses in biodiversity that are having significant impacts at a local scale, and that those local impacts across the globe are beginning to gin up to global impacts. So lots of discrete impacts ginning up to local loss, like we're seeing with the Living Planet Index with these population losses. Since so many people around the globe depend on wild harvested animals and plants for protein and for nutrition, the loss of those populations becomes really important for global nutrition. So again, discrete losses adding up to global losses overall. The other thing I'll say as well is that a lot of the reasons why we are seeing such severe impacts from climate change and these extreme events is because ecosystems have been profoundly degraded and are not resilient anymore. And therefore, you'll see mass flooding, whereas before the ecosystems might have been able to absorb more of those floodwaters. Or you're seeing coastal flooding or storm surge that wipes out entire villages because there's no longer the mangroves and all the associated species that protect the coastlines like they used to. And even in places like Louisiana and in this country, we see even greater impacts of greater magnitude hurricanes because the coastlines have been so severely eroded and have subsided, so that when storm surge comes in, it goes in much further and damages many, many more buildings and infrastructure than it ever has before. And this is one of so it's the impacts we're seeing from climate change are partly because it's the degradation of nature, no longer providing those protective services, the decrease in resilience in nature, and then the increasing impacts of the climate change. So it's really a double whammy. And it's one of the reasons why we understand nature and biodiversity loss and climate change to be so intimately connected.
Right. So if I'm understanding you correctly, it's like we've got, whether we're talking about the services nature provides in helping us, feed ourselves or, protect ourselves from things like flooding, heat, etc., because nature isn't as, we'll say, healthy as you know, it once was, it's less able to provide those sort of protective services.
That's right. And we're even seeing the impacts of climate on food systems. There are around the globe where we have had food production for decades and decades. There's been a real decline, loss of soil health, and a decline of fertility of soils to help with food production, retain water when there is rain during a drought, or when you apply water, and that degradation of the soils has decreased our ability to grow food under a whole range of adverse conditions, thus further degrading the resilience of the system.
Well, and that feels like a really important point. I mean, when we're talking about these linkages, obviously, a lot of people I think envision our food being grown, on a farm somewhere. And as the soils are being degraded, not only does that impact the productivity, our ability to, produce a certain amount of food per acre, per hectare, but as climate change impacts are getting worse, which obviously impacts productivity, then because we don't have the healthy soils, we're not able to, capture that rain from a big, capture that runoff rather from a big rain event, or store the moisture as, temperatures are getting
Exactly.
hotter. So I guess this kind of gets back to that negative feedback loop that you were sort of referring to. So for folks who are maybe feeling, pretty down as they're listening to this prognosis, let's pivot to the solution side.
Mhm.
What are some of the macro level big actions we can take to help stem biodiversity loss?
So what we can do about it is tiered. Of course, it always is. There's what governments and businesses can do, and what we can compel governments and businesses to do to the extent that that's available to us. And there's also what we can do as individuals. It's really important. Right now in Montreal, as we are talking, there is the nations of the world have come together to make a decision about ambitious goals to protect biodiversity globally, to reverse biodiversity loss. And so governments have come together to say, let's set aside or let's conserve 30% of all water and land in collaborative ways so that we can make sure that we secure a future of nature and the future of a stable climate. But as individuals, it's really our unsustainable use broadly in land to produce food, water, and energy that are really driving this change. Food production is the single most significant driver of loss of natural habitats globally. Around 30% of all the land that sustains biodiversity has been converted for food production, and agriculture is also responsible for 80% of the deforestation in the tropics, where there's very, very high biodiversity, plants and animals and fungi, the whole lot. And agriculture also consumes 70% of the fresh water globally. So food consumption, what we consume, where it comes from, how often we eat it, can have a large influence on both climate change and nature loss. So when I think about what individuals can do, it's to really think about how to shift to a healthier diets that are more sustainable, um, to get that sort of double benefit of increased nutrition and healthy planet, healthy people. We have WWF did this, what I think is a really nice report called Planet-Based Diets. So not plant-based diets, but planet, Planet, planet. And it really looked at where different countries are starting from, given their culture and values, where they're eating, and the kind of changes they could make that would be more sustainable over time and more nutritional and stay within their cultural values. Super, super important, because if you do something within your values and in your value system, you're going to be able to make changes that will last over time. The second thing is moderating consumption of those types of food that have a really outsized impact on nature and climate, like sugar, like red meat, like highly processed foods. Those aren't good for your health, and they're not good. They're not so good for your planet. It doesn't mean doing away with them. It just means, maybe instead of having a hamburger 3 or 4 times a week, you do it 1 or 2 times a week. It's just moderating a little bit more, and eating more fruits and vegetables and consuming a wider variety of foods would really help take the pressure off the planet. The other thing, though, that people don't think about is food waste. We waste 40% of all the food that is produced and harvested globally. 40%. That is massive. That means
It is massive.
it's so massive. So if you're wasting 40% of everything you buy, that's 40% more land that had to be converted, 40% more water that had to be used, 40% more species or populations of species that are likely impacted. And so just eating more efficiently, when you go to the store, be clear about what you're gonna, what you're buying, where it comes from, and only buy what you need and eat what you buy, so that you can be smarter about your food choices on a daily basis. It would have a huge impact.
Well, Rebecca, I appreciate you making the time to come on and talk with us about not only an important topic, but certainly a complex one. And I think doing a great job of helping us wrap our heads around what the problem is, how it links to climate change, and why it's really in all our best interest to do what we can, both individually and otherwise, to help address it.
Yeah, Jason, thank you so much for having me on today, and I look forward to see what your listeners are going to be doing in the future to help be part of the solution.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So, gentlemen, what did you think of the interview?
Well, I thought it was really informative. One of the things that popped out to me that I thought was kind of a clever thing, we're always talking about plant-based diet, but when she was talking about planet-based diet, I thought that was really kind of clever. I went to the site and I looked up their planet-based diet, and you can kind of go to that build your own diet based on where you're from, and you go in there, and I selected the US. So I know earlier I was talking about, trying to cut, beef out more, and I was looking at the flexitarian diet they had, and if you click on it, it'll show like the US currently pumps out like 925 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And you click to flexitarian and it goes down to 447 metric tons. So you can kind of see, like, depending on what you've wanted to do, pescatarian or you want to do vegetarian or vegan, it kind of like shows you, and it's not just CO2 equivalent, there's other stats there, and it shows you kind of like how it will reduce all of like the land use and all that stuff. So it's was kind of a cool calculator. So we should link that, with the World Wildlife Fund. It's on their site. Anybody can go to it. It was really cool.
I saw that as well, and I think we'll definitely link it because it provides a nice visual to your point about
Yeah.
how just going from sort of where we are today, whether you're in US or, Sweden or Italy or Australia, you can look at where kind of the baseline is and then look at moving to those other diet types, what kind of a difference it makes, to your point, not just on CO2, but on like land use and water and all those other things that affect biodiversity. Thomas, how about you? Any thoughts from your end?
Oh, look, I think she made it abundantly clear in my mind that we really need to focus on locking up land and stopping agricultural expansion, because ultimately this is the biggest driver of this biodiversity loss. I think all of it, though, goes back to the root cause, and that is global overpopulation, and something where I'm sure we'll do another podcast on this sometime in the future. But there were a few other things that potentially keep in mind, and that is that as we pivot to a zero carbon society that we're careful that we don't end up wiping out more of our biodiversity through bioenergy monocultures such as palm oil or canola oil or whatever it might be that we're growing to use as energy in the future. And even when we look at building materials that are pivoting towards being carbon neutral or carbon negative, such as pine plantations, where we've taken out hundreds, if not thousands, of other species of animals, plants and animals, to replace them with one species of tree. So I don't know. Yes, there were a number of takeaways, but the most important for me was we need to stop pushing agricultural land into areas that are native habitat for other plants and animals.
I suppose all habitats aren't created equal. Some of like those tropical rainforests, that's all pretty high density when it comes to, biodiversity. And so that's a big one, And so when we I know we hammer on beef a lot, but if you're cutting those forests down to increase beef production, that's not a good thing. And so it really does make a difference about what types of foods you're talking about as well, or what type of agriculture. Here in the US, you talk about monoculture. Well, a lot of our monoculture is really due to raising a lot of feed for animals that we're eating, and we wouldn't have to have so much monoculture if we weren't consuming as much meat.
It is really striking when you look at the fact that we're talking about, she was talking about the recent conference in Montreal, which is now completed. And I will say that the upside, the positive, is that the 30 by 30 agreement that she mentions in the interview did actually make it across the finish line, which is fantastic. And in the case of food production, it becomes a double whammy, right? You have deforestation that is destroying biodiversity, and at the same time it's a huge contributor to climate change. So yeah, I think being able to figure out what those natural boundaries are, like what can we live within as humans, and in a way that enables nature to be sustainable, kind of find its footing again. I don't you know I'm sure it's not an easy question to answer, but I think you're right, Thomas, that we need to figure out what is that balance that we need to strike, and we need to live within a tighter footprint. And that obviously brings us back to the amount of things that we consume, and the number of us that are here on the planet, which are ultimately the things that are driving all of this. So yeah, so obviously critical issues that we address, and but one that from an optimistic side, many of the solutions are the same, right? Stopping deforestation, which is about reducing food waste, eating lower on the food chain. Uh,
Putting a price on carbon.
yes, that's a great one, Thomas.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Stopping fossil fuel use, right? Because which starts with making fossil fuels more expensive.
Yeah.
Because the more we can reduce global warming, the less of a downstream impact that's going to have on biodiversity loss. Yeah,
And I think too that the more it'll steer people in the right direction. I look at this situation with all this corn and soybeans being grown to feed cattle in the US, and that's all driven by the fact that fossil fuels have been so cheap that you can afford to feed like animals.
yeah, and I guess that's a good segue into sort of what can we do, and Rebecca had some great suggestions. The things that we're going to recommend for folks this week are first, call on your representatives to end fossil fuel subsidies. It really is mind blowing to think about the fact that we're here, facing a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis, and both of those are being, you know, pushed along by fossil fuels. So take a moment to post on social media, tag your representative, and encourage your friends to do the same. Elected representatives actually do a good job of tracking their social media closely, so it's a great way to get a message across quickly with limited effort. The second option for this week, and this is in line, Todd, with your goal for yourself this year, is if you're not already eating, a mostly plant-based diet, set a goal for scaling back your meat consumption by switching, to meat alternatives, going without, start by estimating kind of how many days a week that you're eating meat, and then see if you can cut back by a day. And, one of the easy ways to do this is to pick a day of the week where pick a number of days of the week where you're going to go meat free. That gives you a nice way to kind of keep track of things. And, and the beauty is it's not only a benefit to biodiversity and to climate change, but it also, is better for your health. Well, that's a wrap for this week's episode. Thanks as always for tuning in. Don't forget to come back on January 17th when we'll be talking with the American Alpine Club about how nonprofits focused in the outdoor space can make a difference in fighting climate change. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co. And as always, don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimist Podcast.